Welcome to a story about the Italian Mafia. I want you to get comfortable, relax in your bed, and listen to this fascinating story. Tomorrow, when you wake up, I'd love for you to support us with a like and let us know in the comments what country you're listening from. In the narrow streets of Palermo, where shutters were lowered before sunset and nobody asked unnecessary questions, everyone knew one name: Luca Belandi. At 47 years old, Luca was considered one of the most powerful men in Sicily. He always dressed in black, wore an old watch that had belonged to his father, and never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The moment he entered a room, conversations would stop. In Palermo, there was a phrase whispered quietly among the people: if Belandi smiles at you, be worried. If he stops smiling, it's already too late. But many had forgotten that before becoming one of the most feared men in Italy, Luca had simply been the son of a poor man. It had all begun in a small workshop located near the harbor. Luca had been born during an especially cold winter. His father, Enzo Belandi, repaired fishing boats. He didn't make much money, but he was known as an honest man. His mother, Sofia, sewed dresses for the women in the neighborhood. They lived in a small apartment above the family workshop. Luca had a younger brother named Marco, and the two of them were inseparable. From a very young age, Luca helped his father in the workshop. By the time he was 17, he knew every corner of the harbor and could repair an engine almost without help. But he had learned something else as well. He had learned that in Palermo, there were men who could make any problem disappear simply by handing over a few coins. One morning, when Luca was 18 years old, three men arrived at the workshop. They wore dark suits and walked with the confidence of men who knew nobody would dare stop them. One of them placed an envelope on the table. "It's a contribution," he said. Enzo looked at the envelope and shook his head. "I can't pay that." The man smiled. "Then you'll have problems." Luca was standing at the workshop door, listening to every word. His father picked up the envelope and handed it back. "This workshop belongs to me. I built it with my own hands." The man's smile disappeared. "That doesn't matter." The three men left. 3 days later, the workshop was engulfed in flames. Enzo died that same night. The police called it an accident. Luca immediately knew it was a lie. His mother knew it too. But neither of them said a word. For weeks, Luca was consumed by anger. He wanted to know who had ordered the fire. He wanted to find those responsible and make them pay. But his mother stopped him. "Your father died because he tried to stand up to men who had nothing to lose," she told him. "Don't make the same mistake." Luca said nothing. But those words remained burned into his mind. He didn't need to be braver than those men. He needed to be smarter. At 20 years old, he began working at the harbor. At first, he carried cargo. Later, he started doing small jobs for different merchants. He was fast, discreet, and he possessed a rare ability. He knew how to listen. While other young men wanted to prove how strong they were, Luca observed. He knew who was in debt, who was afraid, who hated whom, who was lying, and, above all, who was willing to sell out his own brother for money. That was how he caught the attention of Vittorio Moretti, one of the most important men in the harbor. Vittorio was almost 60 years old and had spent decades controlling both legal and illegal businesses. One afternoon, he called Luca into his office. "Do you know why I chose you?" Luca shook his head. "Because you never ask too many questions." "Is that a good thing?" Vittorio let out a small laugh. "In our world, it's what keeps men alive." Luca remained silent. "And what do you want from me?" Vittorio pointed toward a chair. "I want to know if you're capable of doing something difficult." "What?" "Waiting." Luca frowned. Vittorio smiled. "Everyone wants power immediately. You seem to understand that power comes when other people begin to depend on you." That conversation changed Luca's life. For the next several years, he worked for Vittorio. He wasn't trying to become his favorite. He was trying to learn. He learned how businesses worked, how deals were negotiated, how to earn a man's loyalty. and also how an organization could be destroyed from within without having to confront it directly. By the time he was 27, Luca was already running several business operations. At 30, he had men who answered directly to him. And at 32, something happened that nobody expected. Vittorio died of a heart attack. His organization was left divided. Two groups began fighting to take his place. One was led by Salvatore Greco. The other was led by Luca. Salvatore had more men. Luca had more patience. The war lasted almost a year. And when it was over, Salvatore had lost his main allies. Luca hadn't fired a single shot. He had won by making his enemies turn against one another. By the age of 35, Luca Belandi was officially the most powerful man in Palermo. But he didn't look like a criminal. That was precisely what made him dangerous. He bought restaurants, hotels, transportation companies. He invested in properties. He donated money to hospitals. He helped rebuild schools. Whenever a neighborhood suffered from flooding, Luca would appear with trucks loaded with food. People began to respect him. Some admired him. Others hated him. But everyone knew who he was. Luca had understood something his father never could. Power wasn't simply about having money or men. It was about making people believe they needed you. However, there was one person who wasn't impressed. His younger brother, Marco. Marco had studied law in Rome and returned to Palermo as a lawyer. He wanted nothing to do with Luca's businesses. One night, the two brothers argued. "I don't want your money," Marco said. "I never offered it to you. You don't have to." Luca stared at him. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to walk away from all of this." "I can't." "Yes, you can." Luca remained silent. Marco lowered his voice. "Father died because some men decided they could do whatever they wanted. You became exactly like them." Those words hurt Luca more than he wanted to admit. "I would never kill an innocent person." Marco shook his head. "That's what everyone says." And he walked away. For months, the brothers barely spoke. But Luca never stopped protecting him from the shadows. The following years were peaceful. Too peaceful. Luca began to suspect that something was happening. Money was disappearing from some of his companies. Confidential information was reaching his rivals. One of his oldest men disappeared. And then a name emerged. Salvatore Greco. He had survived. For years, he had stayed away from Palermo. Now he was back. But he was no longer the same man. He no longer had the impulsiveness of his youth. He had learned. And he had returned with much more dangerous allies. One night, Luca received a phone call. "It's been a long time since we talked," Salvatore said. Luca remained silent. "You can't hide forever." "I'm not hiding." "Then we'll see each other soon." The call ended. Luca placed the phone on the desk. His right-hand man, Marco Bellini, was standing in front of him. "What do we do?" Luca looked out the window. "Nothing." Marco Bellini looked surprised. "Nothing. I want to know who's working for him." For the next few weeks, Luca took no action. He waited. He watched. And eventually, he discovered something that deeply concerned him. Someone inside his circle was passing information. But it wasn't just anyone. It was someone he had considered family. His name was Alessandro Riva. He had worked with Luca for 15 years. They had grown up together. They had survived situations that would have destroyed anyone else. Luca didn't want to believe it. Until he found the evidence. One night, Luca summoned Alessandro to an old family villa. They were alone. Alessandro entered nervously. "What's going on?" Luca poured 2 glasses. "Do you remember when we were 25? Alessandro smiled. "We were idiots. You wanted to buy a red car. And you said it was too flashy. Luca smiled as well. For a few seconds, they looked like two old friends. Then Luca placed a folder on the table. Alessandro looked at it. He didn't need to open it. Luca, why? Alessandro lowered his head. Because I'm tired. Of what? Of living every day waiting for someone to decide whether we live or die. You could have left. You wouldn't have let me. Luca remained silent. Alessandro looked up. Salvatore offered me a way out. Salvatore doesn't offer ways out. He offered me money. Money doesn't buy a new life. Alessandro fell silent. Luca slowly stood up. What does Salvatore know? Alessandro took a deep breath. Everything. For the first time in many years, Luca felt fear. Not for himself. For Marco. His brother disappeared on a Tuesday morning. Marco's secretary called Luca shortly after noon. He never came to the office. Luca tried calling him. Nothing. An hour later, he received a message. It was a photograph. Marco was sitting in a chair. His hands were tied. He didn't appear to be injured. Underneath the photograph was an address. And a sentence. Come alone. Marco Bellini wanted to accompany him. Luca refused. It's a trap. Exactly. That's why you can't go alone. If I bring men, they'll kill him. And if you go alone, they might kill you. Luca grabbed his coat. Then it's going to be an interesting night. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of Palermo. Luca arrived shortly before midnight. He entered alone. There were 6 men inside. And at the back stood Salvatore. Marco was sitting beside him. I knew you'd come. Luca looked at his brother. Are you okay? Marco nodded. I'm fine. Salvatore stood up. This can all end tonight. Let him go. I want your companies. No. Your properties. No. Your contacts. Luca smiled. And then what? Salvatore frowned. What do you mean? If I give you everything, what will you do tomorrow? Salvatore didn't answer. Luca continued. Exactly. You don't want my money. You want to prove that you can take my place. Salvatore pulled out a gun. I'm not here to talk philosophy. Marco looked at his brother. Luca, don't do anything. Luca stared at Salvatore. And then he said something nobody expected. I'll give you my empire. Everyone fell silent. Salvatore smiled. I knew you'd understand eventually. But on one condition. What? You leave my brother out of this. Salvatore agreed. But before he could approach, sirens could be heard in the distance. The men began to panic. Salvatore looked at Luca. What did you do? Luca shook his head. Nothing. Then he looked toward Alessandro. The traitor was standing at the entrance. He was the one who had called the police. Salvatore realized it too late. You? Alessandro raised his hands. I didn't want anyone to die. The police surrounded the warehouse. Chaos erupted. Luca used the confusion to free Marco. The two brothers ran toward a side exit. But before they could leave, Luca heard a gunshot. He turned around. Alessandro was on the ground. Salvatore had shot him. Luca ran toward him. Alessandro. He knelt beside him. I'm sorry. Luca shook his head. Why did you do it? Alessandro gave him a faint smile. Because you were still my friend. He died before the ambulance arrived. The investigation that followed shook Palermo. Dozens of companies were searched. Several politicians were questioned. Bank accounts were frozen. The name Belandi appeared everywhere. Luca knew his empire was doomed. He could fight. He could hide. He could try to rebuild it. But he was tired. One night, he met with Marco. The two brothers were sitting inside their father's old workshop. Almost 30 years had passed since the fire. The place was abandoned. Do you remember what Mom used to say? Marco asked. Luca nodded. That we shouldn't make the same mistake Father did. Exactly. Luca looked at the old workbench. I think I finally understand what she meant. Marco looked at him. And what are you going to do now? Luca took his father's old watch from his pocket. He placed it on the table. Disappear. And your empire? Luca looked toward the window. It was never mine. Then whose was it? Luca took several seconds before answering. Fears. Over the following months, Luca quietly sold several properties. Some of the money went into legitimate accounts. Another portion was used to pay debts and help the families who depended on his businesses. Marco insisted that he turn himself in. Eventually, Luca agreed. But before doing so, he did one last thing. He bought his father's old workshop. He rebuilt it. And he turned it into a small school for young people from the neighborhood. There, they could learn carpentry, mechanics, and boat repair. At the entrance, he placed a plaque. It contained only one sentence. May no one ever have to become a dangerous man just to survive. Years later, Luca lived in a small town in northern Italy. He no longer wore expensive suits. He no longer had bodyguards. He no longer received calls in the middle of the night. One morning, he received a letter. It was from Marco. Inside was a photograph. The old workshop was filled with young students. The plaque could be seen on the wall. Luca smiled. He placed the photograph in his pocket. Then he looked at his wrist. His father's old watch was still ticking. Many years had passed since that night at the warehouse. But Luca still remembered his father's words. A man is not measured by how much he can destroy, but by how much he can protect without becoming what he hates. For the first time in decades, Luca truly understood those words. He had spent half his life building an empire. He had gained money, power, respect, fear, and in the end, he had lost almost everything. But that morning, sitting alone outside a small cafe, Luca realized that he had not lost the most important things. His brother was alive. His father's workshop was still standing. And hundreds of young people who might once have ended up on the same streets he had walked had found a new opportunity. Luca took a sip of coffee. An elderly woman sitting nearby recognized him. Are you Luca Belandi? He looked up. For a few seconds, he considered lying. Then he smiled. I was. The woman frowned. And who are you now? Luca looked at his father's watch. Now I'm just a man who was lucky enough to discover, too late, what truly mattered. The woman didn't understand. But Luca didn't need her to. He paid the bill and walked away. For the first time, nobody followed him. Nobody watched him. Nobody waited for an order. Palermo was far away. The men who had once spoken his name with fear were gone. His empire had disappeared. But the Belandi name remained on a small plaque above the door of a workshop. Not as a symbol of power. Not as a warning. But as a reminder. Because in Palermo, there were still people who remembered the man who once controlled the city. Some called him a monster. Others called him a king. Others called him a criminal. But those who truly knew him understood one thing. Luca Belandi had never wanted to become the most powerful man in Italy. He only wanted to make sure that no other man would ever have enough power to destroy his family again. And in trying to achieve that, he spent his entire life becoming exactly what he hated most. Until, finally, he found the courage to leave it all behind. Now, let me tell you the story of the orphan who inherited the last lemon grove. In a small village hidden among the mountains of Sicily, there lived a 12-year-old boy named Marco. He had lost his parents during an epidemic. With no family and no money, he survived by helping local farmers gather olives, repair old stone walls, and care for animals. Everyone in the village believed that Marco's life was destined to be one of poverty. Until, one autumn afternoon, an old stranger appeared. His name was Don Salvatore. He was a solitary farmer, the owner of the last great lemon grove in the region. He had spent his entire life growing some of the finest lemons in Sicily. But he had never had children of his own. Instead of hiring strong workers, he chose the poorest boy in the village. No one understood why. For years, Marco learned much more than how to plant trees. He learned how to read the sky and predict the rain. He learned to recognize the sound of the wind moving through the cypress trees. And he learned to tell which tree needed water simply by looking at the color of its leaves. Every day, Don Salvatore repeated the same words. Limons grow with water, but men grow with patience. Each morning began before sunrise. The two of them would walk for miles between the trees, carrying wooden baskets. As they worked, the old man told Marco stories about Sicily, about fishermen, about ancient families, and about generations of people who had lived among those hills long before them. The years passed quietly, and Marco was no longer a child. His back grew strong. His hands became rough from thousands of hours spent working the land. But the old man began to walk more slowly. Then, one spring morning, Don Salvatore did not leave his house. He had passed away peacefully during the night. The entire village came to his funeral. Many believed that the lemon grove would be sold. Others imagined that a wealthy merchant from the city would buy the land. But then the notary read the will. The entire estate. The trees. The small stone house. The tools. Even the old wooden cart. Everything now belonged to Marco. The villagers were stunned. Some were happy for him. Others were jealous. It wasn't long before merchants began offering enormous amounts of money for the land. They promised to build hotels, roads, factories. But Marco refused every offer. He remembered the old man's words. A tree can take decades to grow. Destroying it takes only a few minutes. During the years that followed, Marco transformed the lemon grove without ever losing its essence. He built small stone channels to make better use of the water. He planted new trees among the old ones. And he hired young orphans from the village, teaching them the same trade that Don Salvatore had once taught him. Every worker received food, a fair wage, and a place to sleep. Little by little, the small lemon grove began to flourish once again. Marco's lemons started appearing in markets in Palermo and Naples. Eventually, they even reached the markets of northern Italy. With the money he earned, Marco restored roads, helped the village school, and repaired the old church. People stopped calling him the orphan. Now, everyone knew him as the guardian of the lemon grove. Decades later, when Marco himself had become an old man, a young farmer came to his door looking for work. Marco smiled. He handed the young man an empty basket. And he said exactly the same words he had heard as a child. Limons grow with water, but men grow with patience. The young man took the basket and began walking among the trees. And so, the legacy continued for another generation. Welcome to a story about the Italian mafia. It was one of those nights when the sky seemed far too vast for the earth. High above the hills, a few small lights remained glowing in the windows of the houses. Far below, beyond the old stone roads, the sea rested in darkness and silence. The wind carried with it the scent of lemon trees, damp earth, and fireplaces that were slowly fading into the night. At that time, Sicily was a land of contrasts. There were villages where church bells marked the hours with almost eternal precision. There were fields of wheat stretching as far as the eye could see. There were ancient olive groves whose twisted trunks seemed to hold the memories of entire generations. And there were also places where people learned, from a very young age, that justice did not always arrive when it was needed. In one of those villages lived a young man named Matteo. He was 17 years old. His house was small. 2 rooms, a stone kitchen, and a window through which he could see part of the mountain. His father, Salvatore, worked the land belonging to other men. His mother, Lucia, sewed clothes for families who could afford to pay a few coins for her work. They were not poor in a way that could be explained with numbers. They were poor in a quieter way. Clothes were passed from one brother to another. Shoes were repaired so many times that it was almost impossible to tell what the original leather had looked like. And when winter arrived, the family learned to sleep close together to preserve whatever warmth they could. Matteo had grown up hearing his father repeat one particular sentence. On this land, son, a man must know when to speak and when to remain silent. Matteo had never completely understood those words. Until that spring. That morning, the sun rose behind the mountains and covered the fields in golden light. Matteo was carrying a wooden basket when he saw 3 men standing beside the road. He knew them. Everyone in the village knew them. The first was called Don Raphael. He was a man of about 50, elegant, and always dressed in a dark jacket, even when the weather was warm. He never raised his voice. He never seemed to be in a hurry. And perhaps because of that, many people were afraid of him. Beside him stood Carlo and Vincenzo, 2 younger men who rarely spoke in his presence. Matteo walked past them with his eyes lowered. Matteo. The young man stopped. Don Raphael smiled. How is your father? He's doing well, sir. Raphael nodded. I'm glad to hear that. An uncomfortable silence followed. Birds were singing among the trees. Your father is a hard-working man, Raphael continued. That is worth a great deal. Matteo nodded. Thank you, sir. Tell him I want to speak with him this afternoon. Matteo felt a small uneasiness in his chest. Yes, sir. And he continued walking. He did not look back. But as he moved away, he heard Vincenzo's voice. He's a good boy. And then Raphael's calm reply. Yes. Nothing more. And yet, those words remained in Matteo's mind for the rest of the day. That afternoon, his father returned home later than usual. He entered the house without removing his hat. Lucia looked up from the table. What happened? Salvatore placed his tools beside the door. Nothing. But Lucia knew her husband far too well. What happened? The man looked at Matteo. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he sat down. Don Raphael came to see me. Matteo stopped eating. Why? His father took a deep breath. He says he can get me work all year round. Lucia lowered her eyes. Where? On the Moretti brothers' land. But those lands are far away. Yes. And what does he want in return? Salvatore did not answer. Silence filled the room. Finally, he said, nothing that can be explained easily. Lucia understood. She asked no more questions. That night, Matteo remained awake for a long time. He listened to the wind. He listened to his father's footsteps on the other side of the wall. He listened to his mother praying softly. And he understood that there were things adults could understand without ever needing to say them aloud. Several weeks passed. Summer arrived slowly. The lemon trees blossomed. The village streets filled with dust. In the afternoons, the old men sat outside their homes, talking about harvests, politics, prices, and relatives who had emigrated across the ocean. Matteo began working with his father. But he also began receiving small assignments. Carrying a letter. Delivering a message. Accompanying a man to an estate. Asking about a debt. At first, none of it seemed important. They were small things, so small that they could easily be mistaken for ordinary life. And perhaps that was why Matteo did not understand what he was slowly becoming involved in. One afternoon, Don Raphael called him. Come with me. They walked together along a path between the trees. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Eventually, they arrived at an abandoned house. Its walls were covered with dampness, and its wooden door had been worn by many years of weather. Raphael stopped. Do you know why I brought you here? No, sir. Because you're young. Matteo looked at him. Is that a good thing? Raphael gave a faint smile. Sometimes. He rested his hands on his cane. Young people believe the world can be changed. Can't it? The man looked toward the mountains. It can. There was a pause. But it rarely changes in the way you expect. Matteo did not know what to say. Raphael continued walking. There are people who have money. Yes. There are people who have land. Yes. And there are people who have power. Matteo remained silent. Power, Raphael said, does not always belong to the man who has the most money. Those words seemed to remain suspended in the air. During the months that followed, Matteo began to understand the rules of that world. They were not written down. No school taught them. They were learned by watching. One man might owe money. Another might owe a favor. A family might need protection. A landowner might need workers. And around all those needs were men willing to become intermediaries. They were called many things. Some called them men of honor. Others called them criminals. Some needed them. Others hated them. And almost everyone preferred not to speak too much about them. Matteo began hearing one word more and more often in the conversations of adults. Mafia. At first, it was simply a word. Then it became a shadow. A shadow that seemed to spread through the streets, even though no one could point to exactly where it began. One October night, Matteo received his first truly important assignment. Don Raphael was waiting for him in a room lit by an oil lamp. On the table lay an envelope. Take this to Palermo. Matteo picked up the envelope. When? Tonight. The young man felt his heart beating faster. What is inside? Raphael looked at him. You don't need to know. Matteo nodded. That was one of his first lessons. In that world, knowing too much could be just as dangerous as knowing nothing at all. He left the house shortly after midnight. The road to Palermo was long. Part of the journey had to be made on foot and the rest in a cart. The moon was almost full. Dark trees rose on both sides of the road. The sound of the wheels moving over the stones kept a steady rhythm. For hours, Matteo listened to that sound. Little by little, he began to feel strangely calm. There was something hypnotic about traveling at night. The mountain seemed larger. The world seemed empty. And for a few minutes, he could imagine that his life was different. He could imagine leaving Sicily, crossing the ocean, arriving in America, working in a small shop, having a home. A home where his mother would never have to sew late into the night, where his father would never return with hands covered in soil. But then he would look at the envelope and remember who he was. When he returned to the village, 3 days had passed. Don Raphael greeted him with a simple question. Did you deliver it? Yes. Did they ask you any questions? No. Raphael nodded. Good. Matteo waited. Is that all? The man looked at him. That's all. Matteo walked away. But as he moved through the street, he realized something. He was no longer simply Salvatore's son. Now, some people recognized him. Some men gave a slight nod when he passed. Others stopped talking. And the women standing in the doorways watched him with an expression that was difficult to understand. Pride, fear, sadness. Perhaps all three. Winter arrived early that year. Rain struck the rooftops. The wind came down from the mountains. In Mateo's house, the firewood began to run low. One night, his mother placed a blanket around her son's shoulders. "You are changing." Mateo looked at her. "How?" Lucia took a moment to answer. "Before, you looked at things as if they were new. Not anymore. Now you look like your father." Mateo gave a faint smile. "Is that bad?" His mother sat beside him. "No." She gently touched his hair. "But it isn't good either." Mateo did not understand. "What do you mean?" Lucia looked toward the window. "There are men who spend their entire lives trying to make sure no one can hurt them. That doesn't sound bad." "No." Her voice became softer. "The bad thing is that, after a long time, they forget how to trust." Mateo remained silent. His mother continued. "Don't let this world take away everything that you are." Those words stayed with him for many years. Life continued. Spring returned. The fields became green again. The bells began to ring once more. And Mateo continued deeper into that world. With every passing year, he was given more responsibility. First, he carried messages. Then he accompanied other men. Later, he began attending meetings. There was never much conversation. A room. A table. Wine. Bread. Silence. And names. Always names. People who needed something. People who owed something. People who had made a mistake. Mateo learned to listen. He learned that many important decisions could be made without raising one's voice. He learned that a glance could say more than a speech. And he learned that fear could quietly live inside a room. Without shouting. Without threats. Simply sitting beside the men. 10 years passed. Mateo was no longer a boy. He was 27 years old. He dressed in black. He walked slowly. And he had learned to keep his face calm. Don Rafael had grown old. His hair was completely white. He no longer walked through the mountains as he once had. But he still had influence. One night, he called Mateo. "Sit down." Mateo obeyed. "I want to tell you something." "I'm listening." Raphael looked at the lamp. "When I was your age, I thought power meant making other men obey you." Mateo said nothing. "Then I realized I was wrong." "What does it mean, then?" The old man smiled. "Making other people believe they can trust you." Mateo thought about that. "And is that better?" Raphael took a long moment before answering. "Not necessarily." For the first time, Mateo saw weariness in his eyes. A deep weariness. As if the old man had been carrying something invisible for many years. "Do you regret anything?" Raphael looked at the flame. "Too many things." Then he fell silent. The room filled with the quiet sound of crickets. But regret is a luxury that comes too late. That same year, Mateo met Elena. She was the daughter of a merchant. She had dark eyes and a calm way of speaking. She did not seem impressed by important men. She had no interest in the stories circulating through the village. When Mateo first met her, she was buying bread. He approached her. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon. May I walk with you?" Elena looked at him. Why? Mateo smiled. I don't know. She smiled too. Then perhaps you shouldn't. And she walked away. Mateo stood there in the middle of the street. For the first time in a very long while, someone had said no to him without fear. He liked that. During the following months, they met a few times. They walked together. They talked about simple things. The sea. The lemon trees. The village festivals. The books Elena had read. America. She wanted to see Naples. Perhaps Rome. Perhaps Paris. Mateo wanted to see them with her. But he never told her everything about his life. And Elena, although she suspected, never asked too many questions. Until one night. They were sitting near the sea. The wind was cold. Mateo. Yes. Are you afraid? He looked at her. Of what? Of becoming someone you no longer recognize. Mateo did not answer. Elena lowered her eyes. Sometimes I think you want to get away from all of this. Maybe. Then why don't you? Mateo looked toward the horizon. Because there are doors that are easy to open. He paused. But difficult to close. Time passed. The people who had once surrounded Mateo began to disappear. Some died. Others emigrated. Others ended up in prison. Some simply left the village. Don Rafael grew old until he became almost a legendary figure. One afternoon, Mateo received the news that he had died. He went to the funeral. The church was full. Important men were there. Farmers. Merchants. Old people. Women dressed in black. Everyone had come. Mateo remained in the back. He looked at the coffin and remembered the man who had once walked among the lemon trees. He remembered his voice, his advice, his silences. And he wondered whether the old man had ever truly been free. After the funeral, Mateo walked alone toward the outskirts of the village. He reached the same place where Raphael had taken him when he was young. The abandoned house was still there. The door was still old. The walls were still covered with dampness. Mateo sat in front of it. And for the first time, he understood that he had spent almost his entire life chasing an idea. The idea that one day he would have enough power to stop being afraid. But now he understood that fear never disappeared. It only changed where it lived. The years that followed were quiet. Quieter than Mateo had expected. He married Elena. They had a daughter. They named her Lucia, after his mother. Little by little, Mateo began distancing himself from the businesses. It did not happen suddenly. He simply stopped accepting certain assignments. Then he stopped attending certain meetings. Then he began spending more time working the land. Young men started taking the place of the old ones. Some respected him. Others thought he had become weak. Mateo no longer cared. One summer morning, his daughter asked him, "Dad, why do you never talk about when you were young?" Mateo put down his tools. The girl was 8 years old. Because some things are better remembered in silence. Did you do bad things? Mateo looked toward the lemon trees. Yes. And good things. The man smiled. Those two. Which ones were more important? Mateo took a long time to answer. The things I did afterward. The girl did not understand. But one day she would. Many years later, when Matteo had become an old man, he returned to the sea. He walked slowly. His hair had turned white. His hands were covered with the small marks left by a lifetime of work. He sat on a rock. The sun was disappearing. The sky was filled with shades of gold and violet. Elena was beside him. They did not need to speak. They had reached an age when silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was companionship. Matteo looked toward the horizon. He thought about his father, his mother, Don Raphael, the men he had known, those who had disappeared. He thought about the word that had marked so many years of his life. Mafia. It had been power. It had been fear. For some, it had been family. For others, a prison. And for many, simply a shadow that had followed their lives. But now, sitting before the sea, Matteo understood something different. Shadows do not last forever. The sun always returns. Even if it comes late. Even if no one can see it during the night. Elena took his hand. What are you thinking about? Matteo smiled. Time. A lot of it. Too much. She rested her head on his shoulder. The sea continued moving slowly. One wave. Then another. And another. As if the Mediterranean itself were breathing. That night, Matteo slept deeply. He dreamed of his childhood home. He dreamed of his mother sewing beside the window. Of his father returning from the fields. He dreamed of the lemon trees. The stone roads. The old abandoned house. And he dreamed that he was young again. But this time, he carried no envelope. He carried no message. He owed nothing. He was simply walking. Walking beneath the moonlight. And on both sides of the road, lemon trees were growing. The wind moved through the leaves. The branches swayed gently. The scent of flowers filled the air. And for the first time in a very long time, Matteo had no reason to look back. He continued walking. Each step was slower than the one before. The mountain was quiet. The sea was quiet. The village was asleep. And the lights of the houses looked like tiny stars scattered across the earth. Matteo continued walking until the road disappeared among the trees. And then he understood that perhaps an entire life could be summarized in that way. In the roads we choose. In the doors we open. In the people we leave behind. And above all, in the moment when we finally learn to walk toward the light. Many years later, people in the village still spoke about Matteo. Some said he had once been a powerful man. Others claimed he had known secrets that no one else knew. The old people remembered his youth. The young listened to the stories. But those who had truly known him remembered something else. They remembered that, when Matteo grew old, he rose early. He watered the lemon trees. He greeted his neighbors. He helped the children who passed in front of his house. And on some afternoons, he sat before the sea. Always in the same place. Looking toward the horizon. As though he were waiting for something. Perhaps he was not waiting for anything. Perhaps he had simply learned that some questions do not need answers. The Mediterranean was still there. The mountains were still there. The lemon trees were still blooming. The bells were still marking the hours. And the village, like every village, continued to change. Old stories slowly became memories. Memories became legends. And legends slowly disappeared into the passing of time. But on some nights, when the wind blew in from the sea and the leaves of the lemon trees moved softly, the old people said that something could still be heard. Not a voice. Not a threat. Not an order. Only the quiet sound of footsteps disappearing along an ancient road. Slow footsteps. slower and slower, until they finally disappeared. And then, there was only the sound of the sea. One wave, then another, and another, as if Sicily itself were breathing beneath the moon. And while the sky filled with stars, the village slept. The field slept. The old lemon trees slept. And the stories of men who had once believed they could control their own destiny rested too. Because in the end, even the longest shadows disappear when night arrives. And after the night, morning always comes.